In this video I will show you my Rickenbacker 4001 CS Chris Squire limited edition bass, and I will tell you some of the stories that I went through with this bass and also some technical details about this bass and compare it to Chris Squire's own Rickenbacker. So let's go. It was in the Easter holidays of 1991 that I was in London with my parents for holiday, and I go and buy a guitarist magazine. That magazine, as soon as I start going to the index first pages, I see a photo of the Rickenbacker 4001 CS. I didn't know that it existed, so I saw a bass just like Chris Squire's, and I was very excited, and I started going to the article, and so I found out that there was a Rickenbacker signature edition of Chris Squire. I was very excited to learn about it. At the same time, I already had a Rickenbacker 4001 Jet Glow from the early 80s, although I bought it in the 90s. I didn't think it would be possible for me to have that bass one day, since I already had a Rickenbacker. So anyway, I started to read the article and to learn a few things about that new bass. So I learned that Chris Squire was asked by Rickenbacker to make a copy, and that they took some measures, and they learned about the history of that bass so that they could make a good replica. And so starting with the scale of the Rickenbacker bass, we know that although Rickenbackers look like a very big bass and intimidating at first sight, in fact the scale length is half an inch shorter than the traditional Fender scale lengths, as also I mentioned on my Rennie bass videos, because Eric Rennie also made the same measurements as the Rickenbacker. So it's not such a huge difficult bass to play. In fact, it's very comfortable, and it plays very well. Of course, we know that Rickenbacker is famous for the stereo basses, so the Rico Sound option. That option was only available as a list option on the Rickenbacker catalog in 1971. So because this bass is a replica of Chris's bass, which is a 60s bass, this bass is wired in mono. So in fact it is a 4001S, and that's the American designation for it. And that model, when it was exported, had the name of model 1999 or 1999, and some of you also may know it as the RM 1999, being the RM for Rose Morris, which was the importer of the Rickenbacker, and it was also where Chris was working at the time that he managed to get his own Rickenbacker, which, by the way, was a Fireglow model, so the kind of reddish sunburst model. So as you know, or you may know, Chris's bass went through several modifications, especially during the 60s, where Chris had decorated for 2 times his body and also the neck and headstock with some flower power kind of wallpaper, and then he took it to Sam Lee, the owner of a guitar repair shop in Soho, London, and he had shaved once the wallpaper, and then again Chris Squire turned to began to put a new wallpaper, this time a kind of reflecting metallic wallpaper, and when he got tired of it, he returned to the same shop, and Sam Lee told him, please not to do it again, because he already had shaved a lot of wood from the base. So the next time it would be impossible for him to do any repair to the base. And the only color that, or one of the colors that was available for Sam Lee to refinish the base was this color, and so it stayed like this throughout Chris's career, and now it's also being replicated in the signature model. This color that now Rickenbacker, or then Rickenbacker in '91, named as Cream Glow. As a matter of fact, Chris Squire, in the Starlix video that he had done in 1990, already had presented this bass. So the bass was supposedly ready by 1990. I have selected two quotes from the article signed by Gibson Caddy. The first one is that this is the first Rickenbacker bass to receive the limited edition signature treatment, and it's 4001 based on the specifications of Chris Squire's own distinctive model. Secondly, Gibson Caddy adds, there really is no one more gifted in the art of the melodic complementary bass line than this man. Regardless of whether or not you are a Yes fan, if you want to know what I mean, do yourself a favor and check out the Yes album from the early 70s, particularly Yours Is No Disgrace. It's everything good rock bass playing should be: powerful, melodic, and articulate. So from that article, I also started to learn how important Chris Squire was in the history of music, and especially in the history of the bass guitar, because there was at the time no other means of communication to get information, such as internet or everything we have now. Although I had the feeling that Chris Squire was really special, and he was really a very unique bass player, I didn't have the confirmation from magazines or from other opinions. And when I saw this article, I was much more assured, and I was confirming my opinion that indeed Chris Squire was a very, very important bass player, a very important musician in the music scene. So this Rickenbacker, as the Rickenbackers from that era and from the 70s on, they feature the dual truss rod system. So there are two truss rods inside that adjust the neck relief. Those are known for being more complicated to set up. But this is a feature that it's at the time, I think it was unique from Rickenbacker. The headstock of the Rickenbacker 4001 CS is in fact one single piece of padauk, or vermilion wood, which is also the wood from the fretboard. And by the way, it's also the wood, one of the woods that is made of my Rennie 8-string bass. So in this case, it's just a single piece of wood, whereas Chris Squire's and the Rickenbacker 4001s of that era, they had this kind of sandwich, but in fact there were two pieces of walnut that made a kind of a sandwich with the neck. So here this is mimicked by the paint, but in fact the original model was with separate pieces of wood that were sandwiched to the main wood of the neck, and it was walnut, and here is padauk. Also, yes, I think the dimensions of the headstock on the original 4001S, they are the headstock is a little bit longer than this one. So this one is the same size as later 4003 and 4001 headstocks, and that's about the the only significant dimension difference between Chris Squire's bass and this one. The pickups are, there are two pickups, of course, as in the 4001 and 4003 Rickenbackers, although this one is similar to the 60s Rickenbackers, which uses the horseshoe type pickup with the split magnet here, whereas the most recent 4001 and 4003 models, they have just one continuous piece without this gap here, okay? And according also to the article of the Guitarist magazine, they say that this is a very powerful pickup, and it's so clean that you could swear that that was an active bass. That's by the words of that article. And in fact, what I reckon is that this pickup is very, very loud, and in fact it was louder than one of the active basses that I had. So the signal is very, very hot, or it has a large output signal, louder than this one, the bass pickup. And here is one big difference to Chris Squire's bass, because he had sometimes complained that the output pickup of the treble pickup of his bass was really low, and it was really a very, very teeny sound. So I will play first the bridge pickup, and now the neck pickup. And by the way, I'm using my SenseAmp Paradriver to, you know, just as a preamp to the bass signal. And I'm now playing everything in mono, so both pickups are going through the SenseAmp. But just for you to have a notion of the difference of loudness between the two pickups, okay? So this bass was presented in, at least in the UK, selling for £1,119.50. So that was the retail price in the UK at the time. But then when I finally decided that I wanted really to buy that bass, and because I knew that it was a limited edition, I didn't know there would be more available at the time. This was 5 years later, in 1996. I think at the time there could also be the Bassist magazine, which was the bass department of the Guitarist magazine that separated into a single magazine, and then they merged again into just one. I started to look for Chris Squire basses, Rickenbackers, for sale, and I saw one in a shop called Coda Music. It was also in the UK. At the time I was just starting to work. I had finished my degree in electronics engineering, so I already had a salary, and of course my first option was to buy the Chris Squire bass. And so at the time the process was not simple to get a bass from abroad, and because there was currency issues, and there was not too many options to make the payment. I remember that I contacted Coda Music by fax, and I was going to work and waiting for the fax for them to reply, and then to send another fax. So the communication was still very old-fashioned. And also when we agreed on the payment, I also had to go specially to the bank for the bank to issue an international check. At the time, there was no other means to to pay, except of course if I went especially to the UK to get the bass. But that wasn't the case. I ordered it by fax, and then I went to the bank to issue an international check, and then I sent the check via a standard mail, and then I waited for them to accept the payment and to send me the bass. So the price at the time was a little bit lower than in 91. It was 999 pounds, so roughly £1,000 at the time. And finally, on the 21st of February 1996, the bass arrived at my job location, which was at the university, like a big box. And of course, I was so happy to finally see live. It was like I was seeing live Chris Squire's bass for the first time, because I hadn't seen at that time Yes playing live. As you know, Yes at the time were in a kind of not too active period in 96, so it was just after the Keys to Ascension or the San Luis Obispo shows, and then there would be Keys to Ascension, and there would be just a tour in 98, at least in Europe, with the Open Your Eyes tour. So that was when I finally saw something that was so close to my hero, my musical hero, Chris Squire, and of course that I played it a lot, always home, because at the time I didn't have any bands that I was playing, and I was having my regular job at the university, and so finally I had my bass. In 1998, so finally, Yes were touring the Open Your Eyes tour, and it was Chris's birthday on March the 4th, 98, 50th birthday, and I went to London to see Yes for the first time. And I didn't take my bass with me, of course, but I took my certificate of authenticity that comes along with the bass and with the case, of course. And after the show, we were waiting for Chris to come out for autographs, and I had never seen him. I had seen him live playing, but I never spoke to him. And of course, he was the last one to come out. No surprises. And as soon as I saw him, I went with my certificate, and I asked him to make a signature on the certificate. And so that's my first encounter with Chris Squire, and it was like a dream come true. I didn't have so much to tell him, because at those occasions you always forget what to say. You are just enjoying the moment, or at least trying to. So in 2001, Yes was touring The Ladder, and for the first time they were coming in Portugal. And they made two shows, one in Porto and one in Lisbon. I watched both, but for the first one in Porto, I took this bass with me, and I wanted I don't know what I wanted, but I had a plan. And I went to the show with you will see what happened. I went to the show with this bass. Of course, I took a smaller bag, because the Rickenbacker bag was not very practical. So I took another bag from another bass of mine, and I tried to go into the Coliseum with the bass. And I asked the doorman. I was the first one to arrive at the venue, so I could go to the first row, because the seats were not marked for the ticket. I arrived there and I asked if I can go in with the bass, and he said, "Oh, okay, with me, as long as you don't start playing in the middle of the show." And I said, "Okay, no, don't worry, I won't play." That was funny. So I arrived there very early. As soon as the doors opened, I choose a seat in the front of Chris Squire on the first row, and of course then it was the whole show, and I put my bass under the seat. At the end of the show, usually I think it was roundabout, Chris usually he makes that very typical Chris Squire move that he makes gives a turn to the bass and then holds the bass like this, and with one hand, and makes like that, showing the bass to the audience. And at that moment, I take my bass and I also turn my bass to him. I think he looked at me and was quite surprised. And things we do when you are a big fan. So now we fast forward to 2011, and I am in contact with Paul Wilczynski in San Francisco, and he is from Studio California. He's a specialist on Rickenbacker guitars, especially restoring old models, and he does a wonderful job with Rickenbacker guitars and basses. And through a forum, I contacted with him, and I said that I wanted to make my bass to be wired in stereo, and I had, because of my job, I had a conference in San Francisco, and this would be a good chance for me to take my bass there and for him to make the stereo conversion, because I wanted to be done by a specialist, and no one better than Paul Wilczynski to do that job. And fortunately, he was very kind to accept this. I took my bass on the way to San Francisco. I was lucky because I managed to put the bass on the cabin. He went to the hotel and took my bass, and I told him what he knew already what was going to be done. He also made a general maintenance to the bass, and that's why I have the bass now in stereo, and I can do all the things such as routing the different pickups by different effects, because I have the pickup in stereo, and so my bass is more like Chris Squire's model. So on the way back, I was not so lucky because the dimensions of the compartments in the cabins were not enough for the bass to be stored, and so they had to put it downstairs on the big compartment for the general luggage. I was very worried, of course, especially about the temperature, and when the plane landed in Portugal, I also had to wait a lot because it was that out of norm baggage that usually comes out by another part of the airport. I was waiting a lot, but fortunately the bass was intact. It had some ice crystals still, because it came from a very, very low temperature during the flight. Finally, the last story I want to tell you is not so long ago in 2018, I was going to play with the guitar player Paul Gilbert here in my city, and of course Paul Gilbert is a wonderful guitar player, and he is also a fan of Yes. And I knew that he was already doing a cover version of Roundabout with his band, But for that show, the set list didn't have Roundabout, but he asked the bands that were performing with him to play Honor of Only Heart. And of course we know that on Honor of Only Heart, Chris Squire did not play his Rickenbacker. He played his MPC Electro bass with the built-in effects. But I wanted to take my Rickenbacker especially to play that song, you know, to be a symbolic tribute to Chris Squire. And it was funny because as soon as Paul Gilbert entered the venue, and myself and the drummer, we were already setting up our gear, the first thing that Paul Gilbert said when he entered the stage was, "That's a nice Rickenbacker." So from that moment I knew that you know, I had done the right thing to bring my Rickenbacker to play. And you can also find some footage of that performance of Paul Gilbert playing live Honor of Only Heart with me with the Rickenbacker. So thank you very much for watching this video. I didn't play too much of the bass on this video, but I put a special playlist on my channel, on my YouTube channel, miguelbass, where you can hear some of my isolated bass versions of my bass cover videos. So you will be able to hear just the tone from this bass more clearly, and with better conditions and with new strings. A very special thank you to my patrons at patreon.com/miguelfalcão, who are helping me, supporting me financially with my work, with my music, with my videos. And also, as we are today celebrating Chris Squire's birthday on the 4th of March 2022, we all say happy birthday and thank you, Chris.